At painful times, when composition is impossible and reading is not enough, grammars and dictionaries are excellent for distraction, meaning we all experience painful times and miserable moments and adverse conditions and many other pains and bad things in our lives as both men and women, obviously in different and differentiated ways and manners because everyone's suffering is different in their own ways. Everyone's adversity, misery, pain also can be loss, betrayal, heartbreak, and that means suffering is obviously various, manifold, dynamic, and complex in itself, not only as an entity but also over man and women. Suffering is differently interpreted, understood by both men and women, and from one person to another person, suffering can be different, and the understanding, interpretation of that suffering can also be absolutely fundamentally different, and not just the suffering being different. So that's how this paradox and absolute contradiction of suffering works, which is necessary for a life of greatness, meaning, significance, distinction, happiness, worth, contentment. Suffering, misery, pain, betrayal are all necessary for a life of greatness, sovereignty, differentiation, character, identity, individuality, independence, anyways. But it's the prolonged exposure to suffering is the continuation of unflinching, non-stop suffering, misery into our lives that creates the senselessness, meaninglessness, and worthlessness of suffering itself. So, meaninglessness can also arise out of suffering, out of prolonged exposure to it. But another paradox of suffering is that when a particular man or woman suffers too much early in their lives, then they gradually, naturally, and essentially develop a taste for further suffering, for misfortune in one way or another. That is not really good, not because they wanted to, but because their soul became accustomed to suffering, because now their soul and psychology and the entire psychological structure yearns and desires and craves more and more suffering, misery, torment into their lives, without which they literally feel worthless, meaningless, insignificant. So that is the tragedy of the man and woman who suffer more than is necessary or needed for their growth, progress, learning. But the senselessness of suffering is also dangerous, and it's the problem which still lay over mankind, which has not been overcome by ourselves. How can we navigate suffering? How can we strike a balance, modesty, moderation in suffering, that we like it and we also dislike it, which is good and bad at the same time? How can we live with suffering, which is essential for a non-stop, consistent, unconditional growth, transformation, self-knowledge, self-reliance, self-actualization? Without suffering, those things cannot be attained. True pleasure, we deteriorate